The Void-Siren was not a sound, but a pervasive velvet pressure. A collapsing of starlight that felt less like danger and more like an absolute, lonely peace. It pulsed just beyond the Solace's outermost shields, a predator with the patience of eons. Captain Kaelen Rhys, his silhouette framed by the deep indigo of the emergency lights, didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed on the small, shimmering life pod fleeing the collapsing solar system. Inside, nestled among the emergency reserves, was the reason for this lonely vigil. A being of crystalline grace. A child of a species he had sworn to protect, now utterly alone. The universe often demanded a heavy toll for survival. But tonight, Kaelen knew the price would be borne by one singular, stubborn heart. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply to stay where you are and let the rest of the galaxy fade. Kaelen settled back into the command chair, the recycled air humming a low, hypnotic lullaby around him. The Solace, a decommissioned, deep-range geological survey vessel, was not built for battle, but for observation. Its walls were thick with sound-dampening acoustic panels, a fortunate accident, Kaelen often mused, for a ship designed to map the silent depths of rock now facing the screaming void. He closed his eyes, drawing a slow, deliberate breath. This wasn't his first impossible mission, but it was certainly the quietest. His role was not to fight the encroaching gravitational anomaly, the Void-Siren, but to be a distraction, a beacon, a final flickering light allowing the delicate, unregistered life pod Stardust to gain the necessary warp velocity and escape the doomed sector of the Xylo Prime system. His mind drifted back to the last few frantic, yet strangely peaceful days. The Xylo, an ancient race known for their bioluminescent silicate bodies and their deeply empathic, nonverbal communication, had been caught entirely unprepared. Their great crystal cities, which had stood for millennia, were now silently crumbling into the deepening void. There was no time for a mass evacuation, only enough for one pod, one priceless seed of their future. That seed was a small Xylo girl named Aura. She was no older than a human 6-year-old, her crystalline body an ethereal mix of opal and sapphire that pulsed with soft, rhythmic light. Kaelen had found her orphaned among the ruins of the Xylo archives, a silent, terror-struck child whose only method of communication was the shifting pattern of her internal light. He had carried her to the Stardust, shielding her from the dust and the deepening, terrifying quiet. He had learned the language of her light, a steady blue for curiosity, a vibrant green for happiness, and the shuddering, dim white that had greeted him amidst the collapse. The humans, arriving in the sector for an unrelated resource survey, were the only ones close enough to help. The closest galactic authority was weeks away. Kaelen had not hesitated. He had routed the Solace's entire power to the escape vessel's thrusters, and then he had simply turned around. He rested his hand on the console. A single, small, hand-drawn picture was taped beside the main diagnostic screen. A piece of scavenged paper depicting a stick figure, him, holding the hand of a simplified crystalline shape, Aura, drawn with a salvaged thermal pen. He felt a familiar, quiet warmth bloom in his chest. It was a warmth that came not from a life saved, but from a connection forged in the face of absolute loss. The true strength of humanity, he mused, was never our weapons, but our inexplicable compulsion to care for the vulnerable, even when the logic of survival dictated retreat. Foreshadowing. The Solace's core energy reserves were now dangerously low, but Kaelen had one final, desperate play relying on the ship's forgotten, experimental comm array. The Void-Siren was no longer a pulse, it was a rhythmic pull. The Solace shuddered, the sound-dampening panel struggling to contain the deep, grinding bass of stressed metal. Kaelen activated the distress signal, a standard 3-frequency burst, enough to draw attention, but not enough to explain the complex orbital dynamics of the collapse. He knew the signal was futile. No salvage team would risk this close proximity, and even if they did, they'd arrive too late for him. The signal was for Aura, a marker, a final true north for the small pod to navigate by. Kaelen began the complex, meditative process of stripping down the ship's systems. Every non-essential component was powered down to conserve the minuscule energy remaining in the fusion core. The main lights went out, replaced by the soft glow of the navigation panel. He was surrounded by a gentle, deep darkness, like being at the bottom of a still ocean. He moved to the small, makeshift communications bay. This was the true gamble. The Solace had been fitted with an experimental, decommissioned comm array. It was designed not for data, but for frequency projection, a way to map distant space by vibrating specific energy signatures outward and analyzing the echo. It was a subtle, almost poetic technology, more suited to a musician than a starship captain. Kaelen's plan was audacious, bordering on the absurd. He intended to use the comm array not as a beacon, but as a sonic mirror. The Xylo communicated through light and vibration. If he could project a unique, emotionally charged frequency into the void, a wavelength designed not to transmit a message, but to reflect the Void-Siren's disruptive energy away from the stardust, he might buy Aura a crucial few minutes. He sat before the console, his fingers resting lightly on the holographic keyboard. He wasn't typing, he was composing. He thought back to the few moments he had shared with Aura. He remembered the soft, reassuring rhythm of her light when she had finally allowed him to hold her hand. He remembered the simple, non-verbal gratitude that had radiated from her when he'd given her a warm, sugary ration bar, a vibrant green pulse that was the purest expression of joy he had ever witnessed. "If I can't tell the galaxy where you are, Aura," he whispered to the silence, "I can at least tell the void where you are not." He began to input the mathematical equivalent of those emotional frequencies. He crafted a song of human connection, a pattern of energy that represented patience, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to abandon the innocent. It was a complex, layered algorithm, a digital tapestry of hope. As the comm array began to cycle up, a new, much further frightening presence registered on the deep-range scanners. The Void-Siren was not alone. The gravity distortion was a localized phenomenon, but it had drawn the attention of the dread tide runners, scavenger vessels silent as the grave who preyed on the debris fields left by cosmic disasters. They were pirates, drawn by the faint energy signature of Kaelen's own distress signal, assuming a stranded, easy target. The dread tide runners were known to be ruthless, never leaving survivors. This was the true test. Kaelen had been prepared for a solitary vigil against the void. He had not prepared for an immediate, lethal engagement with his own kind's worst instincts. He had to act quickly, blending his defensive response with a delicate frequency projection for Aura. He diverted the last of the weapon power, 2 small ion pulse cannons designed for asteroid deflection, not combat, to the comm array. He would have to use the very energy meant to save Aura to distract the scavengers. He projected a low-frequency, overwhelming wave of data at the lead scavenger ship. It was not a weapon, but a lie. He broadcast the full, terrifying spectrum of the Void-Siren's gravitational pull, exaggerated, raw, and designed to trigger a primal sense of fear and instability. The pirate ship flinched. Its shields flared, then dropped, momentarily stunned by the sheer, overwhelming wave of false danger. Kaelen seized the moment, pushing the Solace into a sharp, impossible turn, a maneuver designed to look like a desperate escape attempt that had suddenly failed. The scavengers took the bait. Instead of scattering, they focused on disabling the Solace quickly to minimize their exposure to the perceived gravitational threat. They fired a single, calculated energy burst. It struck the Solace's already weakened rear shield, and the ship screamed in protest. Power flickered and died in the main engine conduits. The Solace was now truly adrift, a powerless decoy. The good news, the shock of the blast had amplified Kaelen's carefully composed song through the comm array, sending a pure, resonant wave of stable energy directly into the path of the fleeing stardust. On his screen, a tiny, almost imperceptible icon representing Aura's pod blinked once, rapidly, indicating a sudden surge in warp efficiency. She was through. She was safe. Kaelen slumped in his chair, a wave of profound, exhausted relief washing over him. The sacrifice was complete, but the scavengers were still here, and they would soon realize the gravity threat was localized. He was a sitting duck. The lead scavenger ship, sensing the Solace was dead in the water, began its docking sequence. Kaelen had mere minutes before they breached the hull. He had no weapons left, no engine power, and critically, no way to warn the galaxy of the dread tide runners operating so close to a disaster zone. But he had the comm array, and he had the remnants of his carefully composed, emotional frequency. Kaelen did not run. He did not hide. He reached out to the scavengers, not with a threat, but with an echo of his deepest empathy. He cranked the comm array's projection power to maximum, diverting the last of the core's energy, knowing the ship would overload and shatter in moments. He broadcast his song directly onto the pirate's comm frequency. It wasn't a distress call, it was a transmission of raw, unadulterated human sadness. He projected the emotional weight of his choice, the loneliness of his sacrifice, the profound, universal grief of a life given for a helpless child. He layered the projection with the simple, rhythmic light patterns of Aura's fear and relief. It was an assault of pure feeling. The response was immediate and terrifyingly beautiful. The three dread Tide Runner ships stopped dead in the blackness. Their own dark, aggressive signatures wavered. They were not designed for empathy. Their programming was built on greed and cruelty, but Kaelen's broadcast, amplified by the dying core power, was an undeniable, overwhelming pulse of vulnerability. It was the sound of a human soul choosing sacrifice over survival. For a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. Then the lead ship's docking clamp disengaged. The three vessels didn't fire, they didn't loot. They simply turned. The dread Tide Runners, confronted not by a weapon, but by the shattering beauty of selflessness, retreated into the void. They had been momentarily paralyzed by a truth they could not comprehend, that in the face of absolute despair, a human being had chosen to prioritize the life of another, an alien, over his own. The final surge of the comm array was a magnificent, agonizing burst of energy. The Solace groaned, a sound like a cathedral bell cracking. Kaelen watched the main screen go dark, the Void-Siren's pull now a tactile, intimate embrace. The heart of a human, when pushed to its final limit, is not fire, but a singular, blinding light of unshakable compassion. The silence that followed was total. Kaelen was vaguely aware that the solace had been torn apart, not violently, but gently, atom by atom, into the void. His body, protected for a brief moment by the deep sea of the sound-dampened cockpit, was experiencing the strangest, most absolute peace he had ever known. He was floating, but the sensation was not one of falling, it was one of completion. He opened his eyes one last time. There was no pain, only the deepening indigo. And then he saw it. Far, far off, where the stardust would now be crossing the warp threshold, a single, incredibly faint signal pierced the dark. It was not a message. It was a light pattern, Aura's pattern. She was sending a signal of recognition. It was a slow, steady pulse of brilliant, deep gold, a color Kaelen had never seen in her. It was not curiosity, or fear, or joy. It was the Xyloprime's signal for eternal bond, a thanks that transcended language, light, and death. She knew. She had felt his song, his sacrifice, and she had responded with the deepest emotional truth her species could offer. The human who had stayed behind out of empathy was now bound forever to the future of the species he had saved. As the final lights of the solace faded, Kaelen smiled. He realized the real victory wasn't the escape of the ship. It was the fact that a small, terrified child of crystalline light would now live to tell the story of the human who chose a quiet death over an easy escape. The humans had not just survived the cosmic horror. They had triumphed by changing the narrative, teaching a cosmic lesson to the void itself. That in the vast, cold expanse of the universe, the only thing that truly matters is the light we generate for others. He closed his eyes, the image of the golden light imprinted on his soul. And so, Kaelen Rhys, the star sailor, faded into the eternal quiet. A quiet now filled not with the roar of the Void-Siren, but with the distant, steady bloom of a golden light. His sacrifice echoed not as a casualty of war, but as a monument to the boundless, inexplicable, and overwhelmingly simple power of human compassion.